Chapter 4, Part 2. Winter had set in, the severest on record, with the thermometer below zero and the Seine choked with ice. Throughout the city, coal had run out. For some vestige of heat, the Odeon burned the wooden benches on the top of the gallery. Sarah and her workers ransacked the cellars and storage rooms for further fuel, and crates, platforms, throne chairs, balustrades, and old scenery flats were flung one by one into the furnace. Conditions throughout the city became daily more desperate. Disease was rampant. The cold took its toll of some, starvation of others. By the last week of December, 3,280 citizens had died along with 4,000 of the military, which now including among its volunteers old men and young boys. Food was almost impossible to obtain. Cab horses and the black funeral chargers of the cuirassiers were requisitioned for the markets. Animals in the zoo were slaughtered, and the boulevard houseman profiteer made a fortune out of selling choice cuts from 2 giraffes, 3 zebras, 6 donkeys, and a buffalo. One heartbreaking sacrifice came with the official shooting of Castor and Pollux, the 2 beloved elephants of the Jardin des Plantes, who for years had borne the Parisian small fry for slowly, dignified rides on their patient backs. Famished families cheerfully took their domestic pets to the butcher. The price for a dog was according to its size and whatever flesh it had on it. A cat sold for 20 francs, a rat for 2. A sparrow brought 1.25. Edmond de Goncourt killed his own in his yard, and for a New Year's treat, feasted on a pair of larks. In spite of the appalling hardships, morale was high, fortitude and heroism plentiful. Parisians could still joke to keep up their exhausted spirits. Street hawkers sold cheaply printed songs, one about an elderly spinster apologizing to her parrot for being obliged to wring its neck. A cartoon by Cham shows a line of men and women on their hands and knees outside a rat hole, waiting to grab their prey the moment it emerges. Sarah and her valiant little staff made out as best they could, often going without food themselves in order to feed their patients. All told, more than 150 men were cared for at the Odeon Hospital, as well as 2 women civilians, one who, with frostbite in both feet, was unable to walk further. The other a starvation case who, on entering the lobby, collapsed and died. One day, a prisoner named Franz Mayer, an officer of the Silesian Landwehr, was brought in. Although seriously wounded, he had all the arrogance of the Teutonic conqueror, which he considered himself to be. For when the other men in the ward made the sort of derisive jibes at which the French soldier is an artist, Mayer snorted, "Joke while you can. In less than 48 hours, Paris will capitulate, as we know you're reduced to eating rats and mice." Sarah, overhearing his remark, that evening herself brought the German his supper, saying, "This is how much we are starving, my man." On the tray was a breast of excellent chicken. It came from the last of a small barnyard of live fowl and geese she'd bought at the beginning of the siege, and had housed in the boudoir of her Rue de Rome flat. Another day, a man, injured but still able to walk, arrived at the ambulance, asking for admission. Madame Gerard, who was on duty, told him regretfully that there was no spare bed. Not one. He was blond, blue-eyed, and very young, still an undergraduate of the École Polytechnique. He repeated his request, this time piteously. "Please," he implored. He'd just be there a few days, as all he had as all he had the matter was a shrapnel wound in his shoulder. Then he added that it would mean so much to him even to be under the same roof as Mademoiselle Bernhardt. She was his goddess, and for 2 years now he had worshipped her from the topmost gallery of the Odeon. This was enough persuasion for his goddess, who had walked out in time to catch the conversation. She immediately ordered an extra cot to be put up for the gallant young defender of his country. During the short period of his stay, his worship deepened. He followed her every move as though he were watching a celestial vision. Actually, Sarah Bernhardt, as she went her round of duties, did have a visionary quality about her. Working to the point of utter depletion, existing on starvation rations, she was the shadow of her anything but substantial former self. Her body had the weightless grace of a lovely wraith, and her face, hollow-cheeked and pale, had taken on a new beauty that seemed unearthly, even spiritual. In her nurse's uniform and flowing white coif, with its tiny red cross, she must have looked like an ministering angel to the weary, pain-ridden men. For once she was not Sarah Bernhardt acting a role. She was a compassionate humanitarian losing her own identity in selfless dedication. The day the young polytechnician was discharged as being again fit for duty, he approached his goddess and, blushing like a schoolboy, shyly begged for a photograph with her signature. She smiled, went to her desk to get one, and, dipping her pen in the inkwell, said, "Your first name is Fernand, isn't it?" "No, mademoiselle. Ferdinand." "And your last?" "Foch. Foch, Foch," he said. It was 1918 when Sarah Bernhardt, old and minus one leg, was again giving selflessly of her patriotic services by going into the trenches to recite for the poilus. She was reminded of the incident by the great officer who accompanied her, Marshal Foch, commander-in-chief of the Allied armies. In early January, during the 16th week of the siege, the indiscriminate bombardment of the city itself commenced. The hospitals immediately put up their flags, but Prussians trained their gun sights on the Geneva Cross, and many of their shells made direct hits. The worst raids being made at night, Sarah and her staff moved their patients down into the cellars, where the poor wretches had to suffer the further horrors of water pipes which freezing had broken, flooding sewage and rats that ran over the beds and even tried to gnaw at open wounds. Conditions for maintaining an effective ambulance became impossible, and Bernhardt was forced to close it down. The more serious cases were moved to the military hospital of Val-de-Grace. For some 20 remaining convalescents, Sarah, at her own expense, rented an empty flat in the Rue de Provence, where she, Gerard, and Lambquin nursed the men to recovery. The people of Paris withstood the shell fire with fortitude. It was only starvation, disease, and the complete lack of supplies which, at the end of the 19th week, brought about a capitulation. Bernhardt, in her memoirs, tells of that January 29th, 1871. She had gone for a walk with two friends. The letter says, "Suddenly one of them turned pale. I looked to see what was the matter, and I noticed a soldier passing by. He had no weapons. Two others passed, and they also had no weapons. And they were so pale, too, these poor, disarmed soldiers, these humbled heroes. There was such grief and hopelessness in their very gait, and their eyes, as they looked at us, women, seemed to say, 'It is not our fault.' It was all so pitiful, so touching, I burst out sobbing, and went home at once, for I did not want to meet any more disarmed French soldiers." She did not remain in the capital to witness the yet more galling sight of the German flag hanging from the Arc de Triomphe, and the conquerors goose-stepping down the Champs-Élysées to the strains of Schubert's Marche Militaire, but fled from town, her destination being, of all places, Germany. Late in the siege, a minuscule communication, written on transparent paper and brought in by heaven knows what post, informed her that her son and family were safe and well in Hamburg. Her reaction was one of mixed emotions: relief over the news of their safety and the whereabouts, and rage that her son had been taken for refuge into the country of the hated enemy. She blamed it to the possible maneuvering of her Aunt Rosine, who looked back nostalgically on her past giddy sojourns of love and gambling at Baden Baden. She made up her mind to go to Hamburg and bring them all back as soon as possible. The prospects of such a journey during those hazardous times would have discouraged the doughtiest of men, but not Sarah Bernhardt. To obtain a pass beyond the city limits was next to impossible, but the determined young woman got one through Paul de Remusat, a deputy in the chamber. He was a good friend, and, according to the inevitable rumors, possibly a lover, and de Remusat arranged an introduction to President Thiers himself. Sarah must have switched on an extra voltage of electrifying charm, for that sardonic chief of state gave her a laissez-passer, as well as some stern warnings about the perils of travel for a young and pretty woman during the prevailing conditions of confusion and lawlessness. The trip to Hamburg, which indeed was a nightmare of overcrowded trains, 12-hour delays in rural stations, drunken German soldiers, layoffs in filthy inns, inedible food or none at all, took over 7 days. The return journey, which was equally arduous, took 5, the last 15 kilometers being made in a peasant's milk cart. But the hardships were quickly forgotten. She was at last reunited with her adored and pampered son, and back in her own home.